Before we get started, I'd like to dedicate this shiur to one of the Gedolei Yisrael that passed away, the greatest of the generation that we had left in the world was Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Obviously, they've done dedications throughout the world. And the bottom line is that when you've got somebody that is so great that is the equivalent of maybe thousands of people learning in terms of the level he was on, it means that since he cannot come back and is in the next world, that we have to increase our learning, everybody, because that would, to a certain extent, not that it would ever make up for it, but it would certainly, we have to make up the learning in some way. Does that make sense? At least if not qualitatively, quantitatively, hopefully. So I know we're all doing the best we can. Okay, so
wait, Gavin's not there yet. I went, to Damon. I actually went to it was round the corner from here. The cemetery. Geez, I just walked, just thousands, sea of people, thousands, hundreds of 750,000 people.
Really?
Just seeing, it's unbelievable. And even some non-religious people, because Rav Chaim Kanievsky had a universal appeal, and it was amazing that just to be part of it. It's a 10-minute walk from here to such a place. They closed off a lot of the streets, and the cops were there, and the army, and the border police, and the unbelievable operation, and like literally on my doorstep.
Incredible. That must have been such an experience, Kabb.
They closed off the main roads. Yeah, I mean there were 1,300 buses on the highway, on Highway 4. They closed off that whole highway for the whole day. And just checked, like a lot of Haredi people walking, and even around like on the street, yeah, because they parked. If they came in their own transport, they parked like 3 km. It was easier to walk from this one park, this public parking lot, and actually go on the highway itself. But yeah, it's quite an experience to see such a thing.
Amazing. What a privilege, honestly.
Yeah.
Where I go?
I'm happy. All right, Kevin, teach us.
Okay. Continuing with the theme of people doing work for a Jew on Shabbos, it says, a Jew who purchased the right to collect a toll may rent a non-Jew to collect the toll on Shabbos if he pays him by the job. That is to say, he tells him, I will pay you a specific amount for every 100 dinars that you collect. Okay, then the Ramah says one may also rent the tolls right for every. Yeah. Okay, I can't find that part. Okay, let's just continue. Okay, so continuing here. With the agreement, the non-Jew keeps all of the Shabbos revenue for himself. We do not prohibit it due to concern that people assume that he's collecting on behalf of the Jew. Chazal did not impose the concerns when such a financial loss is at stake. The Jew appointed to mint the national coin shares the status of a toll collector, even though hammering the coins is a noise-making activity that will be heard on Shabbos. The Jew must make sure not to visit with the non-Jew on Shabbos while the non-Jew is occupied with the work, whether minting coins or collecting the toll. Okay, that's the end of that one. Okay.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you guys a favor, because I had a bit of a problem with the recording sort of thing. I've recorded this. I want to, if it's all right with your permission and Arthur's and yours, Kev, to send another link so that I can edit. I'll put the Rav Kanievsky dedication. Okay, guys, where we ended off last time, do you remember there are 2 opinions? There's the opinion of Rabbah, and there is the opinion of Rav Yosef. So Rabba basically says that despair shall affect acquisition. And what we're not sure is, well, Rabba was posing, is it a case where it's biblically initiated, or is it also perhaps only rabbinically initiated? Okay, so he's definitely of the opinion that either way, despair affects acquisition. Rav Yosef didn't agree, because you remember yesterday he brought a proof, and he was saying if one stole chametz and Pesach passed over it while it was in the thief's possession, the thief can say to the owner, behold, that property which is yours is right here before you, take it back as it is. Meaning that since there's no discernible damage that has been done to the stolen item, it looks the same, the thief can return it as is. So obviously, if it's still physically intact, he's proving that despair doesn't affect acquisition, because he's continuing and saying, now in this case, the chametz prohibition arrives with the advent of Pesach, and the owner despairs of having recovered it. Why? Because even if it gets delivered to him by the thief, he can't use it ever. Because if it gets, he can't possess it on Pesach, he can't use it on Pesach, and if it's still in his possession and he hasn't declared it ownerless, then in that particular case, he can't use it after Pesach, and if he doesn't get rid of it and give it to a non-Jew, he can't buy it back after Pesach. So it says, and if it enters your mind is that the owner's despair alone affects acquisition, then why is the law that he says to him, behold, that which is yours is before you? In other words, why, since the thief acquired the chametz that the owner has despaired of recovering, he should be required to pay the owner the equivalent financial value? So, in other words, if despair affects acquisition, then what happens? Then the owner of the chametz despairs at either getting it back, or despairs at the fact that even if he got it back, he wouldn't want it. So then the thief should pay him the financial equivalent. So that's Rav Yosef's proof that despair doesn't affect acquisition, because if it did, then the thief is not required to return the original item, but merely the financial equivalent. So that's proving that despair doesn't affect acquisition according to Rav Yosef. Rabba's got a brilliant answer. I mean, that argument of Rav Yosef was very good. And Rabba's answer is equally as good. He says, when do I say that the owner despairs and it affects the thief's acquisition? Only when this one, the owner despairs of recovering the stolen article, and the thief wishes to, and this one, the thief wishes to acquire it. But in this case, the owner despairs, and in this one, the thief does not wish to acquire it. So what Rabba is saying is, look, it actually doesn't make a difference in this case. It's an exception. Why? Because in order, say this is mine, in order for me to despair, somebody has to want to take it, right? And then it disappears, and then I despair, and then the thief gets maybe to keep it, and then in that particular case, he has to give the financial equivalent. Rabba doesn't hold like that. Any legal act, the thief, if it still remains intact, would have to return it. It's only if it obviously isn't intact. So therefore, despair affects acquisition. But what Rabba is saying to Rav Yosef is the thief doesn't want it, because the thief can't sell it to a non-Jew, okay, and he can't use it, and he can't use it after Pesach. So we say, well, how's it that a thief can be from enough to keep Pesach? And I say to you, because the guy might be financially desperate, but he doesn't want kares. So he doesn't want to be stuck with chametz. So either he stole it on Purim, sobered up and realized he hadn't drunk it and was too embarrassed to get rid of it, and then he doesn't want to have to pay the financial equivalent. So before Pesach, he quickly goes to the homeowner and says, listen, I was drunk. I played a practical joke on you. In the meantime, he actually stole it. He just, when he sobered up, realized and felt terrible about it, but definitely wanted to get it out of his house before Pesach. But we're saying it's a case maybe he only figured it out when he did his Pesach cleaning. So it wasn't enough time, technically, to get rid of it. um, where the original owner could have sold it in time, or he could have sold it in time. So there are cases where people do stupid things, but they're not necessarily bad people. So what is the two cases here is that Rabba is basically saying that despair affects acquisition, but Rav Yosef saying it does not. That's their two polar opposite opinions. Okay? Now, we are saying, do you remember the argument of Rabbah? There was a rabbinical argument and there was a biblical argument. So Rabbah wasn't sure if it was biblical or rabbinic, because if it was biblical, he said, look, maybe we treat it like somebody that found a lost object, that when the owner despairs, the finder gets to keep it. Or maybe, so maybe the thief is treated in the same manner, not that he gets off the hook. He has to pay the financial equivalent, but maybe keeps the original item. Or he's saying maybe it's only rabbinic in nature because there was a rabbinic enactment, which means that it was for allowing somebody to do teshuvah. So they stole a beam of wood. They used it as part of the construction of their house. This isn't a case in the Gemara in Gittin. They don't want to dismantle their house when they suddenly felt bad about it, which they're not going to do. They don't want to lose thousands of rand for a couple of hundred rands of the beam. So in that case, you can pay the financial equivalent. So Rabbah's saying maybe it's just a rabbinic enactment and not necessarily biblical. He says he doesn't know. He's not quite sure. And many of the rabbinic opinions are saying, listen, if the article is still intact, despite the rabbinic enactment, because that's the worst case scenario, you need to return the object as is. Does that make sense? So what Rav Yosef is saying is, okay, so you have to return it as is. So then why can't the guy return a bottle of Scotch whiskey, the thief, the homeowner, before Pesach, just before Pesach, and he has to accept it? And if he doesn't accept it, we understand that because the despair affects acquisition. So he's saying, right, I understand that the original owner doesn't want the whiskey, but he's saying, then can't the thief give a financial equivalent? Because the owner despairs of it, he doesn't want it. So therefore, because he despairs, the thief should give a financial equivalent. And we're saying no, that the thief doesn't, because the thief doesn't want it either. That's Rabba's answer to Rav Yosef. All right, so we're up to date. Let's hit this new issue. And now there's going to be a new discussion. So now there's another challenge, and this discussion is a challenge that a buyer has to Rabbah. Okay, it's not from Rav Yosef anymore. So there's a brisa that states if an olah is his offering, meaning the original owner. So it implies that an offering is valid only when it is the original owner's, but not when it's one that's stolen. Now, if you want to know what the case of the stolen animal that the verse is coming to exclude, okay, in other words, at this point, the Gemara understands that the brisa refers to one who stole an unconsecrated animal and then consecrated it as an olah offering. So at this stage, we're saying that, look, guy had an animal at home, the thief stole it and wanted to consecrate it to the temple. Okay, but we learn that it cannot do so. So if you're saying it's a case where the thief consecrated the stolen animal prior to the animal's despair, then I don't need the verse to teach that it's invalid. Why is that, guys? Why wouldn't you need a verse?
So just repeat the question, please.
So so there's a thief that steals an animal and takes it to the Beis HaMikdash as an olah offering, and we are saying that it's not accepted. Why?
If it's stolen, can't be holy, can't be Mekdesh.
Exactly, because you can't do a halachically prohibited act and sacrifice that to Hashem. It never changes ownership under that circumstance. So we're saying that since that is the case, what would you have to state the obvious for? Does that make sense? So the Gemara is saying, why do I need a verse to teach it's invalid? It's obvious that the animal cannot be brought as an ola, but the thief's consecration does not take effect and the animal remains unconsecrated. Rather, is it not referring to where the thief consecrated the stolen animal after the owner's despair? Thus, learn from this that the owner's despair does not affect acquisition. So what it's actually saying is that, if you have a look, is that the order in which it happened is the thief stole the animal, okay? And then months later, maybe 2 or 3 months later, the original owner despaired of getting it back. At the point that he despaired, it now, according to Rabba, it belongs to the thief, and the thief has to only give, if he's caught, the original value of what that ox is worth. In the meantime, since the ox has become the thief's after the period of despair, Kevin, he could then give the animal as an ole offering because the despair affects acquisition for the thief. In other words, he waited enough time for the original owner to have despair. So the fact that he waited enough time and the original owner despaired means that it would be that the despair allowed for the transfer of ownership, and the thief would only have to give the financial equivalent. And the very fact that this Bryce is coming to say that the ole offering is still originally the original owners is coming to teach that the despair does not affect acquisition. In other words, what's happening here is Abai is saying to Rabbah that if you look at this particular brisa, it's showing that despair does not affect acquisition. Because despite the fact that the despair took place, the Ula was not accepted as the thief's. Therefore, transfer of ownership didn't happen after despair. That's his proof. All right, so do you understand the question? Arthur, give over the question in your own words, in the statement. No, Arthur, come. Oh, come on, Arthur. You're ahead of us with Bava Kamma. You know these things.
Yeah, I'm exhausted. No idea. I can't even think at the moment. I heard the question, but my brain's not firing, mate.
All right, Kevin, give it a back.
It's not going to be exact. You were saying that if the thief steals an animal for an ola offering, and or steals it and waits out the time for the owners he doesn't despair anymore.
No, he does. In other words, he despairs of getting it back. He gives up. He despairs. Yes.
Then he doesn't. Then he doesn't have to return it. Then.
No. Okay. Almost there. Gavin, you want to give it a stab?
So you another answer. What is supposed to say? Just to give Kevin one word. What did you just give him one thing? Oh, okay. So just give me one, please, Damon. Sorry, I've gone absolutely blank.
All right, listen. I accept. No, stop. I accept full responsibility for this. If 3 people don't know, then the problem
is. Can I add to it, maybe, Damon?
It's my fault. Let me give it over again, just in one sentence. Okay, it's my fault then. If 3 people don't chop it, then it's my fault. I can't hear you, Gav.
Your sound, Davin, you sounds like you're in a space station. Right? Your sound is not clear.
Okay, so let me give it over very clearly. So Abaya's got an issue with Rabbah. He's saying, I'll give you a proof that despair does not affect acquisition. Because we're not talking about a case where somebody stole a normal animal and then took it to the Mizbeach. It's logical that if you steal something, it won't be accepted by Hashem. They won't take it in the Mizbeach, okay? That's obvious. We don't need it to teach us the obvious. So it has to teach us something that's not obvious. So what's not obvious is that if the thief waits a sufficient amount of time for the original owner to give up hope of having that animal, the despair that the original owner had of having that animal has come into play, and therefore gave up ever getting it back. So if the thief is caught, he only has to pay the financial equivalent. Therefore, he owns the animal. Okay? And therefore, it should be accepted upon the Mizbeach as an Olah offering. The fact that it's not is proof that despair does not affect acquisition. That's all he's saying. He's saying it's actually a proof that it doesn't. Right. So
then he doesn't. Then what? Then what is the thief? He has to give it back.
So the very fact that the Brisa uses the word his offering means no matter how long you wait, in other words, the Brisa is not teaching you the obvious. It's obvious that if you steal something and the original owner hasn't given up hope of getting it back, that it never becomes the thief, ever, according to Rab or any other opinion, okay? So in that case, it wouldn't teach you the obvious. So let's just play, Abai is saying, let's just play Hashem's advocate and say that if you wait a sufficient time, the original owner will give up hope, and therefore despair will kick in. So once despair kicks in, the original owner loses the right to that animal, and he only gets the financial equivalent back from the thief if the thief is caught. If the thief is not caught, there's no trial. You don't get it back. But if he's caught, he only has to pay that. At the point where he despairs is the point at which the animal would become the thief's. And since the animal has now become the thief should be able to bring it as an Olah offering. Okay? He should be able to. And the very fact that the Brisa uses the term his offering, the original owner's offering, means that this is coming to teach that despair never affects acquisition. That's his proof. That's what he's saying. Okay. Now, based on that, we need to know if this is true or not. So the Gemara deflects the challenge. Rava said to a buyer, now, you know, there's always an argument. You've got Shmuel and Rav, and you've got Abaya and Rava. You know, you've got those two contemporaries. So Rava says to Abaya, but according to your understanding, hang on a second, that the Brisa's exposition excluding a stolen offering does not render to one who stole an already consecrated offering, but to one who stole an unconsecrated offering that he subsequently consecrated as an offering. So let me just explain what this means. Okay, so Rava says to a buyer, let's just see if we've got this clear. A buyer, Rava is saying that a buyer is saying that we're talking about an animal that's in the original owner's domain. It's breathing, it's eating or whatever. The thief kidnaps it and then he consecrates it. Are you with me? He waits sufficient time and then he consecrates it. So he's saying to a buyer, is that the story? Is that that's your understanding of the Brisa? Because there's two ways to understand the Brisa. A buyer's understanding that the animal is normal, it's living and breathing, and it's already at the homeowner. He kidnaps it, waits a sufficient time, and then sacrifices it. And this is a buyer's proof that since it never becomes the thief's, despair never doesn't affect acquisition. But Rava is saying that this is a problem because you have to then assume that the animal was in the homeowner's home and then was consecrated. There is another option, and that option is maybe he stole something already consecrated in the temple and then went to another Kohen to sacrifice it. Maybe it wasn't originally in the homeowner when it was stolen, and maybe that's why it doesn't affect acquisition. Because is that one of the principles is that in order to effect acquisition, for despair, it has to be in the original person's home. We're going to go through why. So all Rava is saying to buyer is, you're making the assumption that this animal was a normal animal, and the thief consecrated it. But that's an assumption. So that's what the Gemara is bringing in. So it's going to go off on a slight, I wouldn't say a tangent, but it's going to go off on a slight different theme, and it's going to come back and link this. So it says, look, how will you explain that was taught in the following brisa? So now Rava is going to bring something to a buyer to prove to him that this animal, in fact, wasn't stolen from the homeowner's home and then the thief consecrated it, but rather it was a consecrated item that was stolen and then tried to be reconsecrated by the thief. In other words, the thief was stole it from the temple area from one Kohen and then gave it to another Kohen to sacrifice. And that changes everything. We'll see why. So he says, look, I want you to explain the following brisa, and then I'll make the link. Now, there's a brisa that discusses a zav. Okay. Now, just to make it clear, in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 15, verse 5, you remember zav is a man who experiences a series of specific types of seminal emissions. Okay. Now, we learn from there that if a zav lies on his couch, okay, a couch that he owns, any article designated for use as something to lie or rest on, it doesn't even have to be a couch. It could be a mat. That couch becomes avatuma. Okay? Because you must remember there's avhatuma, which is, do you remember there's a sheretz, there's a dead body, and there's a zav. But avatuma is when the zav is so infected with tuma that he infects his own couch, and that couch becomes avatuma. And what does avatuma mean? It affects food, drink, utensils, clothing, anything from touch. So, Kevin, this issue in Leviticus is it has to be the zav's own couch, and in order for that couch to become an avatuma, okay? Now, it's known as tumas mishkav, which literally means couch tuma, okay? So, the verse basically states he will touch his couch, okay? And that excludes two things. It excludes a couch that doesn't belong to him. So say he's coming over, Kev, you falling asleep? Okay, so Kev, say the person comes over to me for supper, and I don't know, they've had some seminal discharges or some venereal disease or whatever it is that's causing this thing, and they sit on my couches. My couch does not become an avatuma because it's not owned by that person, thank goodness. Otherwise, you wouldn't have people like this over to you. And if you look at this, that sort of principle, I'm sure, applies to somebody that touched a dead body. Because if you picture this, look, I don't know, because we don't have a paraduma today. But the thing of it is that people that work at the cemetery, and I don't know if it's the same as a zav, I have no idea. But with a zav, it uses the scriptural verse, his couch, which means another couch isn't affected with avatuma. There might be a lower form of tuma, but not that degree. Okay? So which means it means that if the zav stole a couch, it doesn't get avatuma. In other words, somebody else's couch he can't infect with avatuma, and a stolen couch he can't because he doesn't own it. So that's included in the category. Does that make sense? According to both Rashi and Tosfot. Tosfot says he can only affect his own couch, and it would obviously include a stolen couch, which is not his. And Rashi interprets it as purely a stolen couch. Okay.
And it's in this week's parsha, actually.
Exactly. Amazing that. It's true.
Shmini, which is in Vayikra.
Correct. That's exactly it. So what happens is that it implies that by a man will touch his couch is contaminated until evening. That implies that it's only when the zav lies on his own couch that it's rendered an avatuma that transmits tuma to the person who subsequently touched the couch, but not when he lies on one that is stolen. Now, what is the case of this brisa? if you might say that this reference is not where the thief stole a finished couch, but where he stole wool and he made it into a couch, and the Bryce's exposition teaches that since it's not his couch, it does not contract tumas on mishkav, is there anyone who says that a physical change does not affect acquisition? Certainly not. So let me explain to you what it's saying here. Is that Rava is saying to a buyer, look, I want to tell you something. You can't turn around and say with this brisa that the fact of it is that it's the change that has taken place that has caused this problem. So in other words, we're dealing with somebody that's got a tumor and he has a couch, and that couch that he stole does not contain, it's not an avatuma. But now if you want to say that it is, you can't be talking about a case where it's a couch that was changed in status. So for example, he's saying the Brisa must be talking about a finished couch. So let me give you an example. You've got two issues. A thief with a thief that happens to be a zav that happens to be a thief. If he stole the couch, the couch is not infected with avatuma, but it is affected with avatuma Gavin if he made a change to the couch, like a physical change. So say he stole a piece of fabric, right? And then he stole wool and stuffing and upholstery, and he put this thing together, then it's his couch, and that couch becomes avatuma, because even if he stole it, what did he do? He made a significant physical change, and then it becomes avatuma because the thief made a physical change. Do you hear what I'm saying? So, Gav, what am I saying? It seems like all of you guys are a little bit tired. I know you're rolling stuff, and this one's doing that, and this one's doing that.
So what's going on here is that if a thief steals a couch and there's zav on that couch, then that zav does not. That zav, if somebody sits on that couch, that zav will transfer to that person. But if a change is made, now if he stole wool and he made it into a couch, he made a change to the couch, then and it's an upgrade, then that tumor will pass on to the person who sits on it, because then ownership has taken place.
Correct.
It does belong.
Correct. So what it's saying is Rav is saying to a buyer, we're not talking about this case, because both Rav Yosef, okay, and Rabbah, which obviously preceded Rava and Abaya, they were obviously ahead of their time, because he was saying both Rav Yosef and Rabbah agree that a physical change affects acquisition. So the Brisa can't be talking about when somebody stole upholstery and wool and made it their couch that happened to be a zav and stole things, that we're talking about that case, because it's already saying here that the couch is not an avatuma based on that. Because if a physical change took place to the couch, we'd understand it, because then it becomes a thief's couch. Okay? So what we're saying here is this is already a finished couch. So just like that finished couch doesn't contract tuma, okay, so too it's the same in this case. In other words, he's saying that all would agree that this phrase, his couch, cannot be excluded from the verse, his couch. What it's saying is that we're not talking about a couch here where he stole a unfinished couch and he made the changes and then that took place. It says that he stole his fellow's finished couch. In other words, Rav is saying to a buyer, don't confuse this with change that takes place. He's saying that this, the reason it's avos atuma. It's not avos atuma. Is because there was no change of ownership when the couch was stolen. In other words, despair never affected a change of ownership. So in other words, here too, with respect to the first brisa, that the brisa refers to where he stole his fellow's consecrated offering, thus the brisa does not present any difficulty to Rava. So what's it talking about here? So bottom line is he mentions this avatuma to say, look, at the end of the day, if you steal a finished couch, okay, it doesn't affect acquisition. It doesn't affect acquisition because there was no change that took place to the couch, and it wasn't the Zav's couch, and despair never affected the acquisition, the same as that brisa with regards to the consecration, because he's saying, Rava, to Abai, that you misunderstood it. You thought we're talking about a case where the thief stole the animal and then waited a sufficient time for despair, and that the brisa is saying despair still doesn't make the thief own that particular animal in order to consecrate it, and therefore Rav Yosef is saying, we could say that Abai is saying in that particular case that the consecration itself proves that it wasn't accepted, that it never, that despair never affects acquisition. So what Rav is saying to Abai is that the reason it doesn't affect acquisition is Yeush, despair only can occur in the homeowner's place. So he's saying, look, you misunderstood. You thought an animal was stolen from the original owner, and then despite whether there was despair or not, the sacrifice wasn't accepted by the thief. And you proving from there that despair doesn't affect acquisition. The reason why despair doesn't affect acquisition is not because of that, but because the thief stole a consecrated item and wanted to then consecrate it with another kohen. Meaning that in order for Yeush to come into play, it has to be at the original owner's home. So, in a nutshell, what it's saying is that if I give, say I go to the temple and I give an animal for a sacrifice, and I give it to the kohen and I say, just do what you need to do, it's off my head. If it got stolen when it was in the temple area, how would I know? There'd be no despair. Since it wasn't in my place, I wouldn't feel despair because I've done what I had to do. Therefore, if there's no despair, the thief can never own it, even according to Rava. So that's not a proof. So just like a stolen couch is that there's no despair because that the Zav can't infect the couch. It's not his couch. He hasn't waited sufficient time for despair to kick in. Because picture this, a Zav is only impure until evening. So a person doesn't give up on their couch that evening and say, I'll never get my couch back. After 2 weeks of sitting on the floor, he might say, I might probably not get my couch back. But not that evening. And that evening is phoning the police. He's taking notes from the domestic worker. Did anybody come in the property? How did the couch disappear? He hasn't given up. So the Zav is only infected until evening. And because there's no despair that's taken place, Kevin, then the couch cannot really belong to the thief. And therefore it does not become an av atuma. The couch can't be infected. It's not the thief's couch. So just like here, we're not talking about an animal that was stolen from the homeowner. We're talking about a couch. We're talking about an animal that at the end of the day went to the temple. The guy was relaxed, and whatever happened in the temple, it still belongs to Hekdesh. The guy did his duty in terms of his donation. It's not his problem anymore. So there's no despair. Do you understand what, in a nutshell, Rava is saying to Abai? is that you were talking about a case where it's a normal animal the thief stole from somebody's house, then decided to wait till despair kicked in and take it to the temple, and it still never becomes a thief. And that's you using to prove that despair never affects acquisition. We're talking about different things because that's how you interpret the brisa. I interpret the brisa just the same as the stolen couch, that the zav is impure until evening only, and therefore the homeowner never gave up on finding out his couch. He's still getting statements from the maid and what happened and everything. Maybe a few weeks later he'll give up, but not by that evening. And since that is not given up by evening, the zav can't infect a stolen couch. So to here, when a guy's done his duty and taken his animal to the temple to be sacrificed, he's at home relaxing. He doesn't know that the animal got stolen from the temple area. And besides, he fulfilled his obligation. He gave it to the temple. He's done it. What the temple has done with it now, subsequently, it's gone missing, it's irrelevant. So Yu'ush, despair, can only happen when you see something go missing in your place, not when it goes missing in another place. And if the thief, for example, according to even Rav Yosef, sold it to another person, and then the owner despaired, so there was a second chain of events where the original thief wasn't allowed to keep benefit. The person that bought it legitimately, the animal, for example, would then get the animal legitimately, and he could sacrifice it as an ole, because he didn't know it was actually a stolen animal. And then at that point, the original owner obviously despaired. It's been a while. He'll never get it back. So what we're saying is here, a buyer interpreted it as an animal stolen from somebody's house instead of a consecrated offering stolen and being consecrated by another Kohen. So that's Rabba's argument to a buyer, that he's misinterpreting the brisa. Okay, we done. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, it wasn't the easiest, this last bit, was it?
Damon, you see, when you said affect acquisition, it means it still belongs to the owner. That's what you meant.
So what
you've been saying that.
So when I say despair affects acquisition, at the point where the owner gives it up, okay, gives up hope of finding it. Let's not talk of a case of a thief, because a thief, there's a question.
Oh, okay.
But let's just say somebody that loses an article. At the point where he gives up hope, it now is acquired in Bava Kamma by the founder. He doesn't have to give any financial compensation for it. He doesn't have to return the article. I'm using that example because there's not a question by any opinion of that. The question is only with Rabba and Rav Yosef, because Rabba is saying, look, there's definitely a rabbinical enactment that the thief might acquire the article, even though he did something illegal, by the rabbinic enactment in order to do teshuvah. But even Rabba is saying that if the article remains intact, the thief has to return it. It's only if it's no longer extant in existence. Do you get what I'm saying? But he's saying that if you hold according to Beis Shammai, then the thief never acquires it through despondency. Why? Because he stole it first, and then despondency kicked in. So biblically it might not hold water, rabbinically it might, but not if the article is still intact. But despair affects acquisition. For sure, there's no question as far as the find of a lost object. Should he return it? Yes. Should he maybe pay the financial equivalent? Yes. But does he have to? No. Yeah. All right, guys.
Yeah.
You look like you've done 10 rounds in the boxing ring. I love you all. I hope you have a good night. And keep well.
We're feeling a bit rocky.